Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of UFO Man Live. My name is Tim, or UFO Man. My co host for tonight is Rob Heatherly. Rob, say hello.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
Okay, we have a very special guest returning this evening. This is his second venture on UFO Man. His name is Don Schmitt. He is the foremost authority on the Roswell encounter. So if you have questions in the chat room, please post them so that we can pick his brain and find out whatever he knows. Okay, welcome, Don, to the show.
Pleasure to be back, Tim. Thank you for having me again.
Glad to have you. Okay, what I'd like to do to start off is have you tell a little bit about yourself first, and then we'll go into a short refresher on what we did last time, okay?
Well, I had the wonderful, great fortune of being a special investigator for the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who not only was the scientific consultant to the Air Force Project Blue Book, the foremost of the three official government-sponsored investigations of the UFO phenomenon, and then he founded the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, where I served on the board of directors for 10 years, and I was also director of special investigations. I need to emphasize that I was a skeptic. And the one case we wanted to go after was Roswell. And we were so confident we would make a single weekend jaunt down to the land of enchantment and prove that the 1947 incident was nothing more than a weather balloon device that the government still maintains, or something just as conventional, just as prosaic. And here we are all these years later, and I've now, with either my first partner, Colonel Kevin D. Randall, or Thomas J. Carey, I have had now 8 best-selling books on the case. The first book, UFO Crash at Roswell, was made into the Golden Globe-nominated movie Roswell, starring Kyle MacLachlan, Martin Sheen, Dwight Yoakam. We were instrumental, and we were at the very beginning of the founding of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell. And I've led now 5 archaeological digs to the original debris field that was reported at the time of the incident, which started this whole historic, recounting of what I consider the biggest story of the millennium. So for having been a skeptic, and now to say that I'm 99.9% convinced that what did crash outside of Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947 was indeed a craft of unknown origin with pilots, and as amazing as it would sound, one of them was alive, one had survived, and which we also have witnesses to that effect. So welcome to my world, which is to me one of the greatest adventures one can imagine, because it's about the biggest mystery of all time. And I just hope to be at the finish line when the race is over.
Yes, Rob?
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I think I was a skeptic on part of it when I started down this road a couple of years ago in earnest. And I've learned since then I didn't know how much I didn't know when I started. And I've come to understand that we may never hit the finish line with it, but we can certainly learn more than we know now, fundamental, and look into that, in our lifetime, as you said.
Before we get into this really deep, Don, I do have a short testimony from Edgar Mitchell, claiming that it was indeed an alien craft. So here it is.
Can you tell us, Dr. Mitchell, exactly what the locals of Roswell told you, if you could remember specifics?
On the mic.
Yeah.
Yes, it was that the Roswell event was an alien craft, that it was not of this planet. That's the essence. What they really told me was their particular, each one had some particular part of it, like a sheriff's deputy was controlling traffic but heard from what the other people what was going on. The family of the undertaker told about the small coffins that were created for the alien bodies. And my Air Force family friend said yes, he had heard the same thing from Major Brazel. And each one of them just told what their portion of the activity was all about. So putting it all together, the sum total was, yes, it was an alien spacecraft.
And I would not argue that. We had the good fortune of having Dr. Mitchell write the foreword to our Witness to Roswell book. And I did many public appearances with Dr. Mitchell, and we would do TV and radio shows together. And every time we were off mic, we would exchange, latest witness testimony on the case.
Right.
We're still keeping close to the belt, so to speak. But you're talking about not only an MIT PhD professor, but you're also talking about Apollo 14. He walked on the moon. And so Dr. Mitchell was always considered a national hero until he started speaking out about UFOs and specifically Roswell. And just like that, he was suffering from dementia. He had Alzheimer's. He could no longer, be trusted to be speaking as far as on behalf of NASA. And this was from his colleagues at NASA, of all people. So I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. You can't meet, the muster to be chosen to make that, as far as that trip to the moon, and then just because you have opinions and you repeat testimony concerning a specific UFO event, then automatically you're disqualified. Well, I guess you didn't screen the man well enough yourselves. So it says more about you than it does about Dr. Mitchell.
And now NASA is coming out and saying they're going to spend $100,000 over 9 months to discover alien life, correct?
Yeah,
so it's basically they're covering their tracks.
And that's it. That's exactly what they're doing, Tim. Because back during the Jimmy Carter administration, and President Carter at that time was only honoring one of his campaign promises, which was that he was going to release the UFO files. That if they did not indeed threaten national security, he was going to open the vault, so to speak. And granted, the Project Blue Book files were declassified at that time in 1977. Much of it was still withheld. There was 21 gun camera cases alone that never saw the light of day, yet we know they're there. So much for even Blue Book opening up all of their archives. Didn't happen. But when Carter was pressed, well, why don't you start an independent investigation? He threw it to NASA. And NASA immediately turned it down. So you are absolutely correct, Tim. They're just trying to save face. They're trying to play catch up as to, why weren't they interested 50 years ago? And today, okay, now we're going to spearhead this, this new effort. Well, like anything with the government, I'll trust it about as far as I can throw any one of them.
The one thing I'm going to say is the government under President Truman classified the phenomenon as alien.
Right.
But now they can't even say the word. So it's kind of like weird. We did classify it as alien, but now we can't say it. What's up with that?
And in fact, President Truman was debriefed on a regular basis on the entire flying saucer situation. I mean, was he getting nothing but balloon reports at that time? Or was he getting, the hardcore situation of what was actually transpiring? And I have no reason to doubt that it was the latter, because indeed he was the commander in chief. But keeping in mind, right after Truman, who then became president, was Dwight Eisenhower,
Right.
who happened to be chief of staff of the Army in 1947 at the time of the Roswell incident.
Right.
So if anybody would have been fully appraised of the entire situation, it would have been the chief of staff of the Army at that time, who would have been Dwight Eisenhower. And the irony that at the end of his administration, he would have made that prophetic statement about fearing the military-industrial complex. And that's why when we're asked today, where is all the hardware? Where is all the physical evidence? And we will quite, frankly state, it's not in the hands of the government. It's not in the hands of the military. It was all assimilated into the private sector for testing, for analysis. The government doesn't manufacture anything. The military doesn't make a single plane or a tank or a ship. It's all private sector. And it's one of the reasons that we've had firsthand witnesses for years from Lockheed, from Boeing, from Los Alamos, from Rand Corporation, from Battelle Institute, from General Electric, all talking about their efforts in trying to determine what made the craft at Roswell tick, so to speak.
Right.
And I'm also of the position that they still can't find the on button, that after all these failed efforts, that they still have not had a breakthrough. So it's interesting that we talk about former presidents and the idea that, well, yes, they may know of the reality, but there's nothing more to brief them on as to any further understanding of who and what and why we're dealing with. We still don't have those answers.
And wouldn't it be because it was disseminated into the private sector, it makes it free from FOIA requests?
Absolutely, Tim. Bingo. That is exactly the case. In other words, we could, as we do, as even the late Senator Harry Reid stated, that he had a very reliable source at Lockheed that said that they had crash retrieval debris. Now, granted, he retracted that. He wheeled that back. But just imagine anybody who then wanted to target Lockheed with a FOIA would have been slapped right down and went, sorry, private sector can't touch us.
Right. I remember Ben Rich coming out and making that famous statement that we have the technology to take ET home.
Yes.
Although he did not state that it's operational in our hands.
Yes, exactly. That's a great point, Tim, that you picked up on the fact. Doesn't mean that it's operational, doesn't mean that we've even figured it out. It's that we do have it. It just happens to be someone else's.
Right. What do you think, Rob?
I think like with Congress before 2017, they didn't know that the phenomena was real, that UFOs were real, because the 75 year of disinformation worked extremely well. And when they found out after 2017, when New York Times broke that article, they were catching up as well. And just this last couple of years, when they've gotten some of the intelligence committee's briefings, when they were actually shown evidence of it, that they finally gotten on board, and they're trying to play catch up. And now, we've got the Air Force that is trying, that is embarrassed that they have not kept Congress informed when they were asked, even, which I dare say with the Roswell report for Clinton, 1972 or 1992 was not accurate either. They have deceived Congress and the presidents from the DOD under the guise of national security. But I think there are competing programs now that are expressing that they want to try and tackle this. And if some, like the Air Force aren't willing to do it, then perhaps a division of Space Force or NASA or somebody, because Lou said in a recent interview that NASA seemed ambitious and that they were motivated, and there might be some funding put that direction to encourage them to make some progress on it. You know, if this new Ames office or whatever it's called isn't willing to stand itself up, there are other competitors than the DoD that are.
Oh, Rob, you made a wonderful summary of the last 75 years. As far as, just imagine, I'm a sitting member as far as in Congress, or I'm a high-ranking senator, and I realize that there are unknowns that have been invading our airspace. As much as I have heard these rumors, and as much as I maybe poo-pooed the very notion that, well, we would be the first ones that would be briefed. We'd be the first ones who would be kept up to speed as to what was happening. And then, as evidence this past June, when we had the first congressional hearings, and just imagine you have two of the representatives from the Pentagon, one specifically from the Navy, and then the other from the Pentagon. And it was Senator Mike Gallagher from my own state here in Wisconsin, who brought up the situation with Malmstrom, as far as with the entire firing line of Atlas missiles being shut down. And I'm sitting there, and these two representatives, first of all, I would have forewarned the committee that the Pentagon never sends anyone up the Capitol Hill who may accidentally tell the truth. Just has never happened.
Right.
Because then you're opening up such a can of worms, and the next obvious question is, why haven't we been briefed on this?
Right.
Why haven't we been informed on this?
Why have we been lied to for 70 years?
We don't know anything more about this than you do, sir, when we know it's not true. How can an entire firing line of nuclear warheaded missiles be shut down and the Pentagon not know a word about it? I'm sorry. And so this is where we immediately started pushing that there has to be immunity granted to whistleblowers.
Mm-hmm.
This could be they could blow this up overnight. The idea that all these witnesses, all these pilots, both commercial and military, these SAC officers who have had situations involving mishaps with missiles and unknowns, that if I'm sitting there in Washington, I demand to know the truth once and for all. How dare you deceive us, of all people, about matters of national security, when we're the ones that call the shots. We're the ones that tell you what to do.
Yeah, we the people. Yes. Go ahead, Rob.
The two representatives that they had on Capitol Hill, I had looked into their backgrounds a little bit, and they've only been in those positions like 2 or 3 years themselves. So they weren't, they had never investigated the phenomena. They had deniable plausibility, and because until it's written in the books that they took an official briefing on a specific topic like Maelstrom, then they can say that, like during the hearing, that it was hearsay and he can't go off of that, where the congressman pointed out that it was from your own military that we got the information. That gave them deniable plausibility to not take briefings from their staff until after the hearings, so they don't perjure themselves in front of Congress by denying. They don't know what they're going to ask.
That's why they are the ones sent to represent the military, to represent the Pentagon. You mentioned as far as the Project Mogul report, which came out in September of 1994. And that was presented to then President Clinton, as well as both Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, who was pushing for congressional hearings on Roswell. And it was the Air Force's rather preemptive strike in preventing both the president and Congressman Schiff from digging deeper into this by coming up with a third explanation, a third official explanation on Roswell. Now, with your own, both of your own military backgrounds, just think, here the Air Force is attempting to come up with a third plausible explanation for what happened back in 1947. And they select not someone sitting behind a desk at the Pentagon, but they select a lowly captain in the reserves sitting at home who has never had any access, never had any need to know. And they tell him what he is going to research. And he researches the Mogul Balloon Project. So he becomes the authority on Project Mogul. But he knows nothing else. He's a zero risk that he's going to accidentally say the wrong thing. So
Right.
that's exactly the strategy. That's exactly the tactic that they take, and the press falls for it, hook, line, and sinker. Rob, you said you looked into their background. You essentially found out they're two nobodies, no experience, no background,
No.
and no risk of saying the wrong thing. And the same
Yeah.
thing with Captain James McAndrew, who wrote the Project Mogul report. He's in the reserves. No chance he's going to say anything outside of that purview. That is how it's done. And the press, in their own naivety, they never pick up on it. And mainly because they're just lazy journalists. They don't care. They really don't care.
Yeah, I have to say this in regards to the cover up. Tim Burchett came out and he said we were just basically hosed at the UAP hearing recently. We were hosed because they didn't even take the time, as you well know. I saw it, and I don't know how many other people saw it, but they didn't even have time to slow down that 10-second
They didn't know
clip
how to work
of
the
that object going past.
software.
I mean, I was able to do it on my channel and show it clear. So I don't know why they couldn't do it. You know,
They
Because-
didn't know how.
They had no desire to.
Yeah.
They had no intention. They were not going to play into their hands in any shape, manner, or form. They were going to, as Rob suggested, they were going to have their plausible deniability. And they didn't allow it to go to that point by providing any ammunition that could be used against them.
I think two of the key differences this time is we have the internet on our side where we can verify things and fact check ourselves. But this time around, they did have some knowledgeable people where Lou Elizondo and his team had investigated this and found out that there was there was facts to this after all, and were able to give classified briefings on it. And I think it was seminal in what they laid out in preparation for that hearing. You know, with the Wilson documents and Malmstrom, they brought out their most fundamental cases that they already had the answers to, and now they want, you know, and the military knows this. They've got to now come back in around and fill in the blanks of why they weren't telling the truth on this before now and explain themselves. So they're embarrassed in having to tell the truth. They're backed into a corner with it.
And just imagine, as you very aptly put, Rob, they're embarrassed to tell the truth. Just imagine that any one of us would be embarrassed. Yeah. It's like saying, well, I'm more embarrassed for getting caught. They're more embarrassed by the fact that the deception of 75 years is being exposed for what it is. It has nothing to do with national security, has nothing to do with covert operations of making sure that we reverse engineer the technology before the Russians do or before the Chinese do. But they're still trying to pigeonhole their involvement in claiming that the phenomenon only goes back to 2004. And by doing that, what remains as a backup, both Russia and China. When you start going back into the 50s and the 40s, especially post-World War II,
right.
Russia was half destroyed by Nazi Germany, and China was a third world country
and occupied their world country.
Right. And so there's no chance that UFOs, UAPs could have been anyone else's technology back at that time. And the point being that we have to hold them to the fire. They have to acknowledge the phenomena back to 1947. Now, without that, I'm afraid they're going to fall back, as I mentioned, on either Russia or China or possibly Space Force. And as we all know,
Yeah,
the
maybe.
military, just like all departments of intelligence, you're all in competition with one another. Navy is in competition with the Air Force and vice versa, as well as the Army in competition. I mean, you're all jockeying for position. I think the best example was during Desert Storm and the late General Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, that after the first night raid on Baghdad, and he had his press conference, and he was lamenting the fact that the Army, they didn't know if they should march into Baghdad because the Navy was still lobbing in Tomahawk missiles. The Air Force had claimed air supremacy the night before, but we don't know if that was just to ground the Iraqi Air Force or not, or if it was true. And the point being, they weren't talking between themselves.
Right.
How could, I mean, they are engaged as far as a battle, an assault, an attack on a foreign country. And our own branches of the military are not on the same playing field. Well, I surmise from that exactly remains the case today, and specifically with UFOs. That if the Air Force could lob this all into the lap of the Navy right now, they would do it. You come up with a plausible
They're
explanation,
embarrassed.
stick our heads in the sand and just, wash our hands of the entire situation. But that's again where we have to hold, because it was the Air Force, it was the Army Air Corps back in 47. And it was Project Sign, then it was Project Grudge, then it was Blue Book. That was all under the purview of the Air Force. And for them to pretend nothing happened up until 2004, that's the grand deception in all this.
Right.
And we cannot allow them to get away with this, because we may never have another opportunity.
They're utilizing the same estimate of the situation from Project Sign.
Mm-hmm.
It's national security issues. And now the U.S. Navy came out recently and said, oh, we're not going to release any more UFO videos because it may impair the ability of national security operations.
Right.
So it's like, okay, well, all right, what's going to happen there? I know that Rob knows a little bit about that.
Yeah,
Rob?
I know a lot of what's going to happen.
And that's always been a fallback with the military. I can't tell you both how often we've had Roswell witnesses that describe where military officials would come into their homes. And it was always, you cannot say a word about this. You cannot discuss this with anyone, even within your own immediate. And it was always because of national security. It's national security. It's a matter of national security. Well, if it's national security, why aren't you briefing anyone in Washington about something that is their sole responsibility, and that is national security? Every time we send an elected representative to Washington, their first, as far as obligation to their constituents, is the national security, the defense of the nation, the country. And you're shutting them out, you're preventing them from knowing what's going on. When we have aircraft of unknown origin that are able to fly in our airspace with total impunity, but don't tell the president about it because, we don't feel he has the right to know. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't
You're
accept that
defeating
either.
everyone, and you're not going to get away with it any longer.
Rob?
That's the whole reason that Lou, that's the reason that Lou resigned in 2017 when he did, because they refused to allow him to brief Mattis about it. When he recognized, after they tasked him to find out if there's something there, he found out there's something there, not human, and we don't know what it is, why it's here, and we couldn't about it if we wanted to. So they're, him, Christopher Mellon, and their group aren't going to rest. That's why they're replicating this with redundant groups like through Avi Loeb and Billion. They've taken it to the United Nations. They got San Marino and other nations on it. If we can't work it through our government system here, they're replicating it through NGOs and other countries that can replicate it there, that aren't hidden under the guise of national security. to replicate the fact finding abilities and capabilities to where they can outside government bureaucracy and not go to jail by breaking their NDAs. And like you said, the immunity is another thing that's highly to get testimonies and private industries that were involved in these contracts to come forward.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned like even San Marino, and that is with our new group, which is ICER, the International Coalition of Extraterrestrial Research, and I'm the United States representative. And we had our origins in both China and then in Russia, where we had a 5-continent convention where we put together the beginnings of the coalition, which we are now over 30 countries, where we now work towards recognition by UNESCO with the United Nations, that we could literally have a convention at the UN. We could present papers at the UN. So that's our ultimate goal. The irony would be that the truth about the phenomenon would come from another country, that the United States, the major deceiver, after almost three thirds of a decade, or a century, I should say, that we would be now pushing globally. And San Marino, there has been a concerted effort. We're just working as far as with Prince Hans Adam II, who originally was involved with us at the beginning of our Roswell investigation. In fact, he even sponsored our one conference that we had with Roswell witnesses in 1990 in Washington. So we've come full circle in that we need a country to actually represent us as a coalition at the UN, and then we will receive such recognition. So Dr. Roberto Panotti is our president at ICER, and he's the one that puts on this annual conference in San Marino, which I've attended in the past. And it receives worldwide acclaim because it involves the San Marino government. And again, the hope that as long as our discussions continue and they realize that there's more at stake here than just investigating lights in the sky. We're dealing with a global phenomenon that, if we were to know finally the truth behind the entire situation, maybe we might start getting along a little more. Maybe we'd realize that we're nothing more than earthlings on this planet, and we just happen to inhabit one more planet on the block, so to speak. Maybe we'd realize that all of our arguments are rather petty and really mean nothing in the big scheme of things. We would stop thinking we were the king of the hill, and that every little irritation that we would just as soon start a war over, that we could be snuffed out in a second by an intelligence off the planet who just doesn't like the way we look. And so it's like, ladies and gentlemen, it's about time we grow up. It's about time we mature into the factual realization that we are not alone, that we happen, to be part of a galactic neighborhood, and we need to start cleaning up our own backyard.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to get past our barbarism is what we need to do. The
Well,
big thing.
just imagine quickly. Imagine you're off the planet. And Stanton Friedman, our late dear friend, used to often make this comment. Just imagine you're the UFO phenomenon. You're the visitors. And your daily monitoring of our TV and radio broadcasts, what's the predominant theme that comes across day in and day out?
War.
That we are a barbaric, tribal, warfaring, species here on this planet who we don't get along with our families, we don't get along with our neighbors, we don't get along with anyone. And they're going to land on the White House front lawn and say, we come in peace. And our first reaction is going to be, we probably would shoot you.
Well, in 52, They did shoot at him in 52. They blew a piece off the way the account goes, and that Battelle Labs ended up with a piece of material.
And that has always been our response to anything that we don't understand. We shoot first and ask questions later.
I got to mention this. You know, it's funny. The statement is always made that they're flying with impunity in our quote unquote restricted airspace.
Correct.
But the problem with that is restricted airspace is a human concept.
Yes.
So how would they know that it's restricted airspace?
Wouldn't
it
apply
wouldn't
to
matter
them.
to them. It would
Wouldn't
not
matter.
apply.
Wouldn't matter to them.
So
Exactly.
that comment does not apply.
No,
It's just
no.
garbage.
It is garbage. And yet
They know.
and
say-
yet that's one of the reasons that they have no authority. I mean, we don't have any authority. It's one of the reasons that we allow it. It's one of the reasons that, yeah, there have been scrambles, there have been chases, there have been attempts. I mean, we know they have fired on unknowns for decades, but we also know what form of retaliation can take place. We know of
Yes.
pilots that have not come back. We know of aircraft that have disintegrated. We know of cases where people have, gone through their deaths in pursuit of unknowns, but
Right.
it never reaches the front page of any newspaper, does it?
And when it does, the story is kind of vague.
Very vague as to pilot error, or they were chasing a water droplet on their canopy, or maybe it was the planet Venus. Who can?
Yeah.
I've always
our
heard the famous.
highly trained pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've always heard the famous one. It's the reflection off a goose's bag end.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
kind of like the go fast. It's supposedly a bird, but some people do think it's a bird. But in my opinion, pilots are trained to recognize what they're looking at. And if multiple sensors are looking at this object, both on board a ship and from fighter jets, you would think that it would rule out that it's a bird.
Oh, exactly, Tim. And it's amazing that the debunkers, and one of them specifically, amateur astronomer Major James McGaha, who continuously likes to cite the statement that there's no such thing as a reliable observer, as a reliable witness to anything. And as we were talking pre-show, the idea that all recorded history is based on eyewitness testimony.
Right.
And I realized that, yes, 10 people can witness a car accident, and you may have 10 different versions, 10 different accounts. But when something is profound, when something is unique, when something is unprecedented, people will report exactly what they witnessed because they have nothing else to compare it to. We've all witnessed car accidents. We've all seen plane crashes on YouTube and on the news and that type of thing. So we have a preconceived impression of what to expect. And that feeds into our account, our description. When you see a UFO, and I use this argument with Roswell all the time, this was totally unprecedented. And the idea that they would ever forget, that this would ever take a back seat, it would just fade away in their memory as the years would pass by. And as even the late Betty Hill, in talking about her abduction experience with her husband Barney, and she would say, it's the first thing I think about in the morning when I get up, and it's the last thing I think about every night when I go to bed. That's profound. That's reliving something that one will never forget down to the most minute detail. And the idea that as a trained pilot, I see or I experience almost a head-on collision with an unknown. And I would later have it explained the way as a bird. Or
Most people don't
right
realize.
now, go ahead, Rob.
Our fighter pilots are trained to be able to identify every airframe of ally and adversary from the horizon line by their silhouette. They have to memorize every single one of those. So to for amateurs to think that a pilot doesn't recognize another aircraft just because they don't accurately gauge the distance of it. There's a drug smuggling plane or something. It's disingenuous to think that they are completely uneducated on how trained our pilots are, that they are required to be to have that job.
Precisely. And I have often suggested to these people, next time you board a commercial flight, just think about how incompetent that pilot is, because you would just as soon pull them down to your level. But you better damn well know that they're the best person for that job when they take you up to 30,000 feet and then land that plane as well. So please, you're insulting not only them, but anyone who listens to you. And the only ones who even believe and take anything to heart what you claim are only those who refuse to accept the truth, because you people are hardly ever correct. You people hardly, are describing a attitude that is of genuine intent, that you're only trying to protect us for providing us with an alternative truth. No, you have an agenda. You are useful idiots who work for somebody else, whether you realize it or not. But you've been part of the deception for 75 years. And when all is said and done, when you're gone, to be remembered as someone who was a master deceiver, well, isn't that a proud claim to fame throughout the course of a life? That you were a master at deception. Isn't that a wonderful? Well, etch that on your headstone.
Right. A lot of people
I found a lot of these guys.
A lot of people that are working toward transparency are being portrayed now as master deceivers,
Right.
by social media and by other platforms, to make them look uncredible, not having any credibility, and trying to stop their narrative, which they're pushing it at the congressional level to get files and documents and videos and everything declassified by the president so that we can get it out there. You know what I'm saying?
Well, and as I've also pointed out, that the debunkers have stepped up. They've ramped up their efforts since 2017, since that New York Times December of 2017 article, as though they are losing the battle. Though I would always remind them, for those of you who would like to believe you've won the war,
right?
Why do you continue to engage us? Why do you continue to provoke us? Why do you continue to try to meet us on the battlefield, albeit you're always attacking us from behind? None of you are brave enough to ever do it to our faces, but yet you see that for your failed efforts, and they are failed efforts, that the phenomena has not gone away,
right,
that the sightings continue. And here we're on the precipice of Congress allowing whistleblowers to finally testify. Do we believe any of you debunkers are going to be called to testify as to what they didn't see? No, they're going to talk. They're going to listen to people who were at the controls of a 747, who were flying an F-117 stealth fighter, who were manning Atlas or Titan missiles back in the 50s and 60s. They're going to talk to the likes of a Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who knows what he saw and knows what he heard, and no one's going to ever take that away from him.
Right.
And so the tide has turned, but it's now a matter that as we have righted the ship, that we now have to keep it going in that direction. Because if these hearings do not transpire, if the whistleblowers, and I heard once again today that they are lining up, that they are ready to come forward like never before, because they will have immunity. They will not be at risk of loss of their pension or
Right.
any form of government reprisal. They will be able to testify as open as any of our witnesses have heretofore. So I'm excited because it's the one thing that we were pushing for, that they have to grant immunity. They have to allow these most important of all witnesses, the eyewitnesses who have had the experiences, who are the most highly trained people in our military, in our space program, our elected officials. When a President Jimmy Carter, as the governor of Georgia, had that sighting
Right.
on that particular night, why shouldn't it be revisited? I mean, the idea that they walked away thinking they saw something highly unusual. Well,
If
he was
you,
just the governor. What does he know? Well, but then the governor of Arizona, Governor Symington, during the Phoenix Lights experience, he had to wait till he left office before he admitted he saw the same phenomena. He saw as far as the lighting formations that same night.
Right.
The taboo has to be lifted once and for all. And that's
yeah,
where the bunkers are working overtime, because that taboo is their main weapon and they know it.
Right.
you also have to look in the motivations of why they're fighting disclosure. Part of them I found with some of the most popular debunkers right now, their past history. One of them, I'm not going to name his name, but the reason he's motivated is because he was terrified as a child reading about the phenomena and UFO and abductions, to where he had to convince himself that not only did UFOs not exist, aliens don't exist, God doesn't exist. He cleaned the slate, and he can't allow any of this to become real, because then his nightmares come back. So he's
Interesting.
fighting that. The market,
And
it's on his own blog. I can direct you to it.
I know who you're talking about, Rob. And the idea that they would transfer their own phobias, their own psychological paranoia onto the rest of us, unbeknownst to what their motives are. Not only would that be considered medical malpractice, but also journalistic malpractice, as well as investigative malpractice.
He was also
And
bragging about debating monks and trying to flip them to atheism and strip them of their faith, because he didn't want them to believe either. I mean, that's cruel. That's cruel.
it is cruel. I mean, and yet he'd be the first one to point the fingers at us if we would just basically tell him, you need help. And
I
you're
feel
not
bad
going
for
to
him.
get it from us. You know, go to the professionals. Don't lay it on us. And yet, no, he's using us essentially as his guinea pigs. And it's a sorry state when it'd be no different than if we had an abductee, someone who had a legitimate experience in their mind, that they thought that they actually had a genuine UFO abduction. And then they went out of their way to try to enlist everyone who has had a UFO experience and try to convince them that they too were abducted.
Right.
And create nightmares and flashbacks and this imagery that who knows how they might be affected. And that would be just as cruel. And I don't know anyone on our side who's doing that, but yet they get away with it because they're part of the grand deception. So they have their power in their numbers. But that's ending. And maybe it will come out just how devious they've been in some of their own shenanigans.
When the Air Force has been, they were the most well-funded and well-trained and well-equipped military on the ever in the history of humanity, to acknowledge that they are powerless over this. I'm certain with all their sensor data, they can't see things are coming in and out of the atmosphere, the orbit, and the oceans when they go transmedium. They know of every transmedium shift and in numbers and what quantities. They had to know on the Tic Tac incident with the Nimitz how many there were in orbit and where their movements were, where they originated from. The Navy only has control over the battle space with their sensory data, but the Air Force has the entire planet. So they
Right.
could have told them where these things are coming and going from and in what numbers. But, instead, the tapes were pulled from them even to where they didn't have access to it afterwards. And they conveniently were misplaced now.
You make an excellent point, Robin, that I was, as a civilian, I was given a tour of Space Command at Holloman Air Force Base back in 1995. And I was taken to a third level down. And I was shown, and they demonstrated to me how they were tracking everything airborne around the planet at that given moment. The idea that at any one given moment, they are able to track everything around this planet. What's interesting is it was at the time of, again, Desert Storm.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked the captain, I said, so in other words, when Saddam Hussein was launching the Scuds into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, you were tracking them here. He went, absolutely.
They can track 10 centimeters to 20,000 miles. An object 10 centimeters in diameter.
And so
24,000 of them right now, I think.
So when they talk about they're tracking objects that are defying the laws of physics, now just imagine they're acknowledging, I mean, they're using that very terminology as they did with the Tic Tac incident, that this craft defied the laws of physics. That in itself would rule out anything that we have on this planet.
Yeah.
Unless there's something that they have managed to reverse engineer. Maybe we have come up with something of anti-gravity. Maybe we have something of a fusion or fission technology that it's able to make right angle turns at full velocity. But then you'd have to create almost like a gyroscope, a zero gravity within inside the craft that it wouldn't mash the pilots through inside the craft.
Gravity.
Exactly. So maybe we're getting there. Maybe we're getting there. But until they acknowledge that technology, we have to accept it's someone else's. It's someone else's.
We didn't even get to.
And because they came up with the term UAP,
right,
unidentified aerial phenomena, they kind of broadened the umbrella under which these objects fall now, so they could rule it out as anything, interdimensional, multiverse.
And then they really broadened the classification in their last year's report in June when it was called other. It's referred to as other.
Now it's aerospace underwater. What's the new one of the new phrases is aerospace underwater phenomena.
Well, we had that covered even before, with just by just calling them USOs, unidentified submarinic objects or submarine
up
objects.
To 300 knots now.
I know
200 knots was impossible. 300 knots is doubly impossible.
Just imagine submerged underwater. Just imagine the amount of thrust, the amount of force, the amount of power it would take to move at that speed underwater.
And no cavitation.
No cavitation. That's the other thing. And when it enters the water, there's no splash.
Yeah, no splash. And just imagine the cavitation as far as what you would have. Look what you have on the surface of a boat when a boat is doing 60 miles an hour. Just imagine underwater at that speed and 3 times higher. Inconceivable.
They're superconducting to where they're slipping through the electrons of other mass around them to where they're not even interacting with it like a neutrino. They're basically
as they do in our atmosphere and not create a sonic boom. Yes.
Quantum physics for macro objects is what they're doing.
It's an interesting theory, interesting consideration, and I think you're right on, Rob. That would totally make sense. Yes.
Because if you're
I have
familiar
to
what
point
people
out a
pairs are,
sorry. I have
sorry.
to point out a comment in the chat. Church of Organic Life says I have a photo of a crashed disc at Holloman Air Force Base. I don't know anything about that.
Well, we had a supposed landing at Holloman in 1964,
Right.
but there have been, okay, now there was an MP unit that came in from White Sands, Holloman Army Air Corps,
Right.
at the time of the Roswell incident. We even know the officer who was in charge. It was a Colonel Lovejoy, as I recall, if I had that name correct. But there have been rumors that Holloman was involved with crash retrievals thereafter. So if this gentleman could contact you two in any way and establish, I'd love to see the picture. I
would too. Church of Organic Life, if you want to contact us, I will leave my email in the below the posted live stream after we're done with the stream. So you can contact us, okay?
And whatever information he could provide as to how he happened to acquire this, and if he himself has a military background, was he stationed at Holloman at the time that he happened to come up with this, and that we certainly would guarantee his confidentiality. In my case,
Right.
I'm looking for the information. I'm not looking for a name. It's
Right,
just,
same here. We'll keep you anonymous. So if you want to send in your information, please feel free to do so. And I'm sure Rob can also put out his email in the description beneath the live stream. That way, if you can't contact me, can't get a hold of me, you can get a hold of Rob.
and either one of you will get in touch with me then. Excellent.
And then we'll send it off to Don Schmitt. Yes.
Very good.
What I'd like to know is, how does this come full circle? Do you think that Roswell will finally be admitted to as being an actual alien encounter because of the progress we're making in Congress?
If there was to be any reopening of the Roswell incident, I think it would open up such a Pandora's box that they lose all control. I think by just acknowledging that, keeping in mind, we are up to 4 official explanations on Roswell. 4. The first being the flying saucer, to which we interviewed over 600 witnesses. The second being the Rowan weather balloon device, which is basically just a sonobuoy. And there are 0 witnesses to that effect. And then in September of 94, they came out with Project Mogul. Same balloon, same materials. It's just that they had, as far as a suspended microphone, with the theory that should the Soviets detonate the first atomic bomb, which they did in August of 1949, we'd pick up the sound wave, the shock wave in the upper atmosphere. Project failed miserably, didn't pick up anything at the time of that detonation in Russia. But nonetheless, the explanation, for whatever reason, is accepted by many of our colleagues because they believe a conventional explanation for Roswell than it was anything off the planet. They believe in UFOs, but they don't want Roswell to be genuine because it takes all the air out of the room, so to speak. The moment you mention Roswell, because it's the granddaddy of all UFO cases.
It's also acknowledging that some segments of our DoD have known the truth, but they've kept it from the balance of the DoD and the government. After a certain point, like you'd said in your recent prior interview, they had died off. They stopped reporting eventually, and some of these programs, I think, didn't intentionally go dark completely, but they just didn't know at some point who to report to anymore, and then they just sat down and shut up. And now's their chance to come forward and come clean and be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So,
and you are correct, Rob. They go underground. They rename or they recode a particular project, and they did that during Blue Book. There were other groups within the military that were assigned to actually do legitimate investigation of the UFO phenomenon. And those reports would go directly to Washington, whereas Blue Book, headquartered at Wright Pat in Dayton, Ohio, and you had a director, you had 2 investigators, and 2 secretaries. That was the extent of Blue Book. And a scientific consultant, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who once a month would drive down from Chicago down to Dayton and wade through a stack of mundane reports. But what they weren't counting on was during the weeks leading up to that visit by Hynek, he was talking constantly with military officers, with pilots, with SAC officers who would divulge some of the most fascinating, most intriguing cases that just defied conventional explanation. And then he would be at Blue Book and he'd be paging through all the. And where's that case from Holloman? Where's that case from? And they would act like we don't know what you're talking about. Well, Hynek, they weren't aware of the fact that Hynek had just talked to the SAC officer.
Yeah. In the Condon report,
he realized that the true data was going to the Pentagon, and that Blue Book was nothing more than a front. It was a PR. That's all it was. And so that's what is happening in many respects right now. The Air Force / the Navy is hoping that if they can contain, if they can confine this just to be over the last, 18 years, that a conventional explanation may still suffice.
Well, if I'm correct, you were saying that I think in one of your prior interviews that they didn't start putting bodies in balloons until 52 of dummies, and they were reverse engineering a story after the fact. So in future years, the misinformation campaign or disinformation, they would pick up on those and confuse it with the actual facts. And eventually they tell the story enough, it gets replaced from the actual factual data, that you provide, and your constituents with the obfuscated version that the government wants to keep pushing forward.
Well, and they never were launching balloons with crash dummies. They were using them for high altitude oxygen breathing apparatus testing. Dr. / General Randy Lovelace, in designing high altitude for paratroopers, oxygen masks, he was the first one to test one of his own devices. And he received severe frostbite in a hand that the glove had come off during the drop. So thereafter, they were using crash dummies. But they were dropping them, they were parachuting them down from high altitude. But that project, there were 2 projects. There was High Dive and Excelsior. And they didn't originate till 5 years after Roswell, 1952. So you're absolutely correct. And the idea that this is what the witnesses in 47 were confusing. How is it that you are stationed at the base in 1947, but you somehow misinterpret something that happens 5 years later when you were no longer even in New Mexico with what you witnessed as to actual biological beings, not wearing harnesses, not wearing parachutes, not having wooden and metal hinged arms and legs, and not being 6 feet tall as the crash dummies were.
And the local undertakers, if I'm not mistaken, were asked to provide child-sized coffins to the military.
Precisely.
And what would be the point of that?
We even talked to the son, whose father was a trucker, a contract driver, who would drive from Roswell up to Amarillo, Texas. And they made an emergency run during that time to pick up child-size caskets. And when they returned back to Roswell, the city had been cordoned off. They had to circle around town and come in through the west side, the back side, just for him to be dropped off at home while his father dropped off the caskets at the base hospital. So again, I don't recall that the Roswell Army Airfield had any dwarfs or any little people on duty or assigned to the base at that time. And there certainly were children working on the base.
Was the 509th Wing that was called out to that site, were they the only local detachment in the area at all to be called out?
No. You had, and the 509th being the most famous, being the first atomic bomb squadron at that time. But you also, as far as other bombardment groups, you also had the 393rd, you had the 715th, and then you still had other, like the 1395th, which was the MP unit. You had
so you had buck privates and things that were like infantry that they could have sent out for busy work to pick up trash and debris. But instead, they showed us our most trained 509th that are in NBC warfare, the elite of the elite squads, to go out there. You don't send out that kind of a team for trash pickup.
Precisely, Rob. The idea that you have the elite, they were the most highly trained unit. They were a composite unit where they selected the best officers, the best pilots, crew, doctors, nurses. If you swept a broom on that base back in 1947, it was because you were the best sweeper.
Here's another thing.
Because you all had a top security clearance.
Exactly. That's what I was getting ready to say. That just struck me. They would also all be bound with high security clearances, and ergo why a lot of this didn't get out from the military of personnel that were on site, because they already had those clearances. They weren't told and threatened after the fact to sign NDAs or it'll kill you. They were already under contract with their clearances, and they didn't want to lose them. They didn't want to lose their pensions. So they sat down and shut up to keep their oak leaves and things.
Exactly. And the officers were always the hardest nuts to crack because for fear of loss of benefit and rank, they had the most to lose. Whereas the enlisted men were the ones that we would get them talking. But then we'd quickly learn who their commanding officers were. And then we would approach them. Well, we have it from a reliable source, someone who you commanded back in 1947 at Roswell Army Airfield. And I had one officer, he just kept repeating over and over again, why is it so important that you know the truth about this? And I would then respond, oh, so there is a truth. There's something that we're not being told. And then he would smile, and then he would still come back. But why is it important that you know? Well, quite clearly, we're talking the biggest story of the millennium. I think everybody has the right to know.
And they swore an oath to defend this nation, and they are in violation of that fundamentally, because there is what could be a threat that we couldn't mitigate potentially, and they aren't even acknowledging its existence outside of their dark silos to even get the whole of government or the military looking at this to ascertain if we can decide if it's a threat or not, and if it is, or if it, if it's not happy with like our nuclear assets and things, we need to be aware of that, and we should have had the discussion 75 years ago.
See, now the military would say that at the time, and this is the beginning of the Cold War, that this would have fallen under the very notion of covert activity. The idea that their first concern would be preventing the news, preventing the information, and especially preventing the physical evidence from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union at that time. So that they would say that would trump any concern that anyone in the public sector or anyone on Capitol Hill would need to know the truth about this. Our first concern is preventing this from leaking out. And then secondly, their concern would have been attempts at reverse engineering the technology. The race was on. If it would happen here, the question is there a Russian Roswell, so to speak? So So before even the race to the moon, we may have had an initial race as to who was going to develop this off the earth technology starting in 1947.
Both of the Russian and the United States government, though, early on knew that this was not human technologies, to where they had a hotline agreement to call each other during the Cold War to not start a nuclear war if they could confirm to the other that it's not us, that the anomalous track, it's one of them, so don't fire. And so they knew at the heads of the government and the military that there was something else there, or they wouldn't have that in place.
And you are absolutely correct, Rob. And there were such discussions with the Soviets. In fact, during the Kennedy administration, there were meetings, there were concerns that a war could start just by the misidentification of an unknown, with the consideration that it could be a launched missile.
Mm-hmm.
And that we could accidentally, as far as retaliate, we could launch as far as on our own in response, and neither side being responsible because it was an unknown. I remember that even Donald Keyhole, in his last book, he referenced that during the Nixon administration, that NORAD had admitted to over 70 times that they were on standby for launch that turned out to be nothing more than a UFO situation. And thankfully that there's this fail-safe system that we mutually have with the Soviet Union, with Russia. Mm-hmm. That it has, as you two know better than I certainly, that it has to go through that whole process, that whole step, that whole procedure. And one of those considerations is, are we dealing with a UFO? Is it that is causing this false?
I can actually say this. NORAD, after they a few years after the Cold War ended, they actually installed some type of sensor system within their system itself. So when they were detecting UFOs, they could filter them out.
Discern between the two, right?
Right, so that they could actually turn around and discern. Let's see. I wanted to mention that in regards to the Air Force, when we were talking about the Air Force knowing about the situation with the existence of ETs, they've known about it for a long time, because in the training manual for air cadets at the United States Air Force Academy, there is a chapter on how to encounter and deal with a firsthand one-on-one ET encounter. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with it? How do you talk to it? How do you approach it? Things of that nature. And it's actually in the manual. I know this for a fact. I clarified it with my sister, who was married to a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force, and they lived on the United States Air Force Academy. And my sister told me, she had seen a manual with that chapter. So it does exist. So that gives me pause in thinking the Air Force is known for quite some time, and they even wrote something about it. So why aren't they coming out more and releasing information? That's my question.
And then, Dr. Hynek is responsible in that the FCC, the flight control centers that handle respective airspace between airports, and like our particular flight control center is in Aurora, Illinois, and it handles like 8-9 states with 90 radar screens, and it's able to distinguish between weather anomaly and astronomical and transpondered, non-transpondered, that type of thing. But there's an entire chapter in their manual in how to report and who to send reports to of UFOs. And then if we remember the Frank Edwards book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business. That very title came from the Air Force manual at that time, that the
Right.
chapter on UFOs was entitled Flying Saucers, Serious Business.
Right.
You're
So it's
absolutely
been
that they have known since 1947 that we're dealing with a phenomenon off the planet. Yes.
and why they
We
don't
were
come out with more information is astounding. It's they're it's like the Navy is the one that's coming out with all the information and not the Air Force. And the Air Force is stalling. But recently, the U.S. Navy said we're not coming out with any more UFO videos. So that's kind of frustrating as well.
Of course it is. And initially, was it just a case of where the Navy, now keeping in mind when we talked earlier about Project Blue Book, declassified during the Carter administration in 1977.
Right.
And this was the third official investigation of the UFO phenomenon. It was to cover all branches of the military. And yet, of the 13,000 cases Blue Book investigated, 701, which I should point out, remained unexplained. That's hardly a blip on the screen. 701, that's quite an astounding number of unexplains. Well, nonetheless, of the 13,000 cases, only about a dozen were Navy. There are no Army cases in Blue Book, no Marine Corps, no Coast Guard. So what became of all of those reports?
Right.
The Navy, and certainly having greater global coverage during that time, there certainly should be if anything, the Navy should have matched the number of cases. So is it presently just a situation where the Navy is saying we're tired of the Air Force speaking for us, we're now going to speak for ourselves? And they were rather amateurish in going public, and then they didn't think that anybody would push for disclosure beyond an acknowledgement, and now they're trying to put the genie back in the bottle by saying, but we're not going to release anything. So they're going to try
I think
to.
what happened is a continuation.
Right.
I was just say with a continuation of what happened with to start with a grudge from Gary Reed, and also parts of the military-industrial complex that don't want actual disclosure. Two fronts that go through the same desk now of Susan Go, who by trade in the military was PSYOPs and wrote the paper where you can't separate public affairs from psychological operations of information. They have coordinated through the Pentagon all UFO, UAP related topics from the military have to go through them and one coordinated office and her desk to be disseminated from a central point. So they have forced even if the Navy wanted to talk now, they can't without clearing it through the heads at the Pentagon at the highest levels. I can't remember the name of the office right now, but they are having to funnel it through that one point before it can go public on anything related to UAPs.
And as you would bring up the fact that they have had this PSYOPs project at the Pentagon for all these years, and how often UFO witnesses have been told, you didn't see anything. There's nothing to report. Nothing happened. And then if you had more obstinate individuals involved, how often that the military may have resorted to playing mind games and efforts of brainwashing and hypnosis in trying to discredit their own. And to me, that also remains alarming. The idea that the military, and as you both know, the military is a dictatorship. You follow orders, and you do as you're told. And there's a high price if you don't. The problem that the military has had from day one are the number of civilians involved. I hearken back to Roswell, the fact that you had all those civilians, the ranchers, their families, their hired hands. You had all the people, the media in Roswell. You had the sheriff, the fire department, all these civilians who were involved. You can't order them to do anything. And yet they did.
No.
Yet they ordered the sheriff. They ordered I mean, and as you both know, the military has zero authority over civilians unless martial law be declared. Well, you couldn't declare martial law because then that hardly would account for a weather balloon incident.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to resort to other means.
Right.
Spell them out in gory details, so to speak, in our books. The idea that they resorted to threatening parents with the deaths of their children.
Mm-hmm.
Children would never see their parents again. And
Yeah, and
we were told by a high-ranking officer at Wright Pat that we should go back and look at all the accidents at that time. And he very smugly smiled and said, they weren't all accidents.
and there's a very high percentage of families that were still in the military because we were just coming out of World War II. That even those civilians, they had family members that were still in uniform, and there's a lot of leverage there to be applied. That we may not be able to access you, but we can still affect them, through legitimate means and not have to break the laws. They can do a little. So with that threat alone would be very intimidating.
And they were. And as you mentioned, just coming off of World War II, but keeping in mind as well, the military was God back after World War II. They walked on water. All the return of all the heroes from the European to the South Pacific Theater, and all the ticker tape parades and the ceremonies and the parties of celebration, the rebirth of the country, rebirth of the world in many respects. And then to have that glowing relationship. And this is something, again, the skeptics have no explanation for. That prior to the Roswell incident, you had this family bond between the locals in town and the base, the military.
Right.
And that's where Dr. Mitchell was part of that. He was in the high school. He was in the Pecos Valley school system at that time, south of Roswell. He experienced that. He saw that. They loved one another. And then right after the incident, it was total distrust, total disdain for one another. And not that either side was guilty of maligning or hurting or threatening anyone. That was typically done by outside personnel that came in because nobody would recognize them. They came in, did the dirty work. They were the hitmen. They were, as far as the Gestapo, that applied all the pressure. And after things calmed down, city of Roswell was left. Well, we still have to coexist with the base, but now everyone's informing on one another and everyone's looking over their shoulder and no one's trusting anyone. And a balloon caused all that? No.
Yeah.
Again, you have no explanation for that. And I have had that described to me time and time again from the people who lived there, from the people who experienced it. And I'm sorry, it would have to be something that would rise to the level of either where there was an atomic accident and people got hurt and people were exposed, and all of a sudden there's distrust of the military. But the point being, it went both ways. It wasn't just for the military. It was the military at the time of the Roswell incident who also no longer talked to the civilians. So whatever happened affected both of them mutually, uniformly.
you would have that unit that did that was there, the 509th. They would be feeling guilty. They'd want to talk to people about it, but they couldn't except among their own unit, and they were probably tasked with not talking about it with them either. But they couldn't share what they knew, and they couldn't talk about it when they were asked, and they would feel bad for that. So instead, you just avoid the civilians and have to walk away, and that would, unfortunately, even if they had the best of innocent intentions in the military, still preclude them from any positive relationship further with the civilians in the area.
Exactly.
Which would cause bad blood in some cases.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly did back at that time. Now, I also resent when, especially members of the media, refer to Roswell as a conspiracy. No, it was a response to an event that is historically documented. Something did crash. The Roswell Army Airfield, the elite in the military at that time, put out a press release claiming they had actually captured a flying saucer. 5 hours later, historic fact, it was recanted, and it was then explained away as a weather balloon device. But in reality, the actual wreckage still went on to Wright Field for testing and analysis. Well, a balloon would have no requirement, no need for that. But the fact that the wreckage did go to Wright Field for testing and analysis is also a matter of historic fact. The Pentagon put out that press release after the balloon story stuck. The point what I'm getting to is that looking at it historically, looking at the basis of what was behind all this, the response to an incident is not a conspiracy. The response was a cover-up, a deception that continues up to this point. That's not a conspiracy. A conspiracy, as we know by the definition of the very word, is when a group of people conspired to perpetrate an event, a crime, something that threatens national security, an assassination, what have you. Roswell, it dropped into their laps. They had no control over the situation. The fact that they responded as ingeniously as they did was because they were already prepared for a possible atomic accident. If you remember that who was head of the Manhattan Project was General Leslie Groves. And Robert Oppenheimer often complained when Groves would arrive at the test sites at White Sands about who these other officers and who these other people were with him. And he would always tell Oppenheimer, don't worry about it, they're with me. Well, later in Groves' own writings, he talked about his S unit, his S1. And these were people who were trained in the event of an atomic accident. So in other words, if the test went awry, if any subsequent testing went off course or civilians were injured, they had people that would immediately be able to come in and contain and cordon and control the entire situation. So it's been our position from the very beginning that the people that came into Roswell were most likely these very people, these MPs, these officers, these doctors, these nurses. And they were able to treat it like an atomic accident minus an atomic accident.
It had the equivalency reactions, what you're saying, psychologically and physiologically in the local environment. That's how they responded.
How to shut Roswell down, how to close them off from the rest of the world. And they effectively did.
Yeah. And what unit would be more equipped to do that than them? That was what they were trained to do.
Precisely.
And the other thing they fail to mention is everybody refers to Roswell as the Roswell crash. But it wasn't Roswell where the crash was.
No.
I mean, they handled the bodies and the wreckage But they didn't have
And
a
they put out
crash
the
in
press release.
Roswell.
And they put out the press release, and everything that was recovered, it was transferred to Roswell. But the actual, the nearest township, the county that the object exploded and created the debris field was Lincoln County, and the nearest town was Corona. Now, my partner Tom Carey and I, we had on two occasions a town hall meeting at the Corona High School with the hope that we would bring in all the old timers, all the old ranchers, long retired, and we'd be able to pick their brains, ask them questions. Well, the exact opposite happened. They sat there and they peppered us with questions for the evening. But it always came up. You're always doing lectures all over the world, and especially Roswell. How come you've never done one here in Corona? And I said, well, yeah, we should do that. And in fact, I'll have my partner Tom do that. We'll set it up and he'll do a talk on the crash at the Corona High School right here. In a couple months, we'll get it set up. Well, we set it up and it was promoted through the area. They had 200 chairs set up in the gymnasium. Not a single person showed up.
Wow.
Why is
Tom
that?
Perry, famous Corona talk where nobody showed up.
I wonder why that was.
Well,
Considering there was interest.
and there
You know,
was.
that's-
Again, maybe they were afraid we'd turn the tables on them. And
There was so much trust sowed in the 75 years. They would think it was a trap. That why now, after all this time, would anybody be coming in to talk to us about it unless there was some kind of new subversion that's going to take place? So yeah, they didn't trust.
Rob, you make an excellent point in that for many years, we were known as the revenuers. We would show up in New Mexico in suit and tie, and we'd be knocking on doors, and we'd be, meeting with government officials, and we've been meeting with the mayor and city, all in an effort, all in an attempt to find new witnesses, to get to the bottom of what actually transpired back in 47. And the thought that we would even have these town hall meetings and the fact that they disabled us, would not allow us to ask them questions. They were asking us, they were peppering us with questions. And the fact that they then would not show up for a presentation with the thought that we'd be taking names. We'd be writing down, individuals' names who were in attendance, for example. So they didn't want to place themselves potentially on any
Public
listing
forum.
of individuals who were crossing that line, who maybe were with families who had been warned 50 years before, never to get involved, never to say another word about this. And here they were attending a talk on the very case they were threatened and warned into submission over. So that's an excellent point, Rob. I never thought of it that way before, but yes.
They would think the initial talk was an invitation, that was just happenstance, and that they could control and wouldn't feel like it was a setup.
That was a trap.
Inviting them back, then they started to question because of generational mistrust that as they sat and thought about it, they're like, well, how do we know this isn't really government that are doing this and you guys are working for them? How do we know? We don't. So they default back to the fear factor that's been instilled in them. So, that PSYOP is still alive and well. They sat down instead to be safe about it and wouldn't come forward.
The fact that they would have even set up 200 chairs that they expected, potentially that many people, and each one of them a possible lead or knew of someone else who we may in turn have contacted. And it may be something as simple as they were told, stay away, don't go there, because this will lead to nothing good on your behalf. Or as you described, Rob, that they would see it as a potential trap. and they weren't about to fall for it. So, it served as a good example of that. There's much more at stake here than just going to hear a talk on a UFO crash. That you had an entire community of where something that big had actually transpired, and yet they didn't show up.
You know, those people in Corona might have had information that the powers that be just didn't want released.
And that they saw us as enough
Potential threat.
as
a threat.
We have the tenacity that we weren't bowing down. We were going after every and any possible witness.
Right, exactly.
And that could have been
there was
a true hornet's nest.
If it was just urban myth that Roswell was actually a crash, or even the controversy, and that the government or agents came in and threatened people, if that were all urban myth, then that fear factor wouldn't still be instilled in these people at this, 75 years later, into the children of the adults that were there being threatened at the time. So they can't, on its face, they can't say that Roswell was mundane, because that fear that's instilled generationally, you don't do that for a weather balloon. And that proves right there that concealment was in place.
Right. And whereas if it were nothing but an urban myth, something that they could come and just be entertained, have a good time, come and ridicule and make fun of. And
there'd been standing room only. They'd bring their kids, balloons. They'd have a party of it instead of empty chairs.
And you're talking about a community where the nearest theater is 2 hours away. One little lone diner is their restaurant. They drive around in circles on a Saturday night, hoping that somebody is doing anything, and that becomes the gathering, the central meeting for the evening's entertainment. Mm-hmm. And so this was out of the pale. This was something that would have been like showing a special movie for the evening. Entertainment that they would have never had otherwise. And they stood it down. They stayed away. This is wonderful, Rob. I never thought of it that way before, but from a military standpoint, yes.
The psychology, you can apply the psychologies that it fits to a class or a entire population. They're demonstrating a mass, not a psychosis, but a mass psychological deep-seated fear as a whole. It's been institutionalized generationally.
And if only a handful of people would have showed up, at least you might say, well, we didn't promote it as well, or the interest really isn't there. But the fact that there was zero, not a one, no one even drove by checking out if anybody else was in the parking lot. It was as though there was this vacuum where everyone just stayed away from the high school that night.
Not even the person that asked you. Not even the person that asked you to have a conference there.
Well, yes, we did afterwards. I approached him and why didn't you show up? And he really gave me a very convoluted explanation, as though it even made him nervous that I would pose that question to him. It wasn't like, we had company, or we had a dinner party, or we were out of town. He tried to come up with an explanation that really didn't fit. As though, well, do I really need to hear what I already know? He didn't really say that, but it was like he was fishing for words, and I could see that he was uncomfortable.
Almost like he was backed into a corner.
Right.
The law of the lid with natural leadership abilities. There are people in that community that were safeguarding like sheepdogs. Say, like when the union tried to come into a company that I was with a long time ago, a lot of people looked up to me, and the union leaders tried to get me to flip the other workers to signing up, but I saw that, our community couldn't afford union in our lower, in our small community. And instead I influenced them to not step up and join, and it didn't go through. But, there were those of us that had that kind of influence in the community to protect them, and they trusted us. So it sounds to me that trusted people in that community spoke up and said, hey, do you guys remember what happened when this went down? What all the threats were made to our families that were lifetime threats? That is still in place, that we're not supposed to talk for perpetuity. So shut up, and we're not going to say a thing because we don't know who they're with.
Right.
I think you truly have hit the nail on the head, Rob. And I think where we up till now, I've often, if Tom and I are doing a press conference or a panel discussion, I have often had a ringer in the audience who will ask, Mr. Carey, can you tell us about your famous talk in Corona? And Tom would then very shyly admit where nobody showed up. Well, now you've raised this to a much more relevant consideration. And as we've discussed this, I think it's more important than ever. I think that the fact that absolutely no one, that zero people showed up, is much more significant than if we would have had a full theater.
You need a behavioral psychologist or psychiatrist. Those people, there is an entire community still living in fear, and they shouldn't be. They need people they can trust to go in there and finally put this to rest. They don't have to decide whether the phenomenon is real or not. They just have to discern that the threat doesn't exist anymore, and that they don't have to be afraid anymore of that. They should at least be convinced of that and broke loose of this fear that they're in. Because every time Roswell's brought up, people come into town and strangers show up, they get scared.
And they should, and as we've often told witnesses, let's call their bluff. There's power in numbers with all the people that have come forward, have testified on the public record. And it's more dangerous to remain in the shadows, because that's when accidents, that's when things happen, and no one puts the two incidents together. So
I have to say that when my old co-host, the one I had before Tom Reed and Rob, was working on the channel, he went down to Roswell. He saw the museum and all the sights and sounds. He tried to interview civilians on the street in regards to the Roswell event. No one would talk.
No, that is true.
Because they don't know who he is,
right,
what his intentions are, what his agenda is, so on and so forth. So they were protecting themselves. They would say, yes, we know about it, but I don't want to talk about it. And they'd leave it live. So Rob is correct. Someone is either warning them to not speak at this current time if they're not in the inner circle of people that they know, or because they're afraid, like Rob said. I do agree that.
And this particular situation happened now 24 years ago. So it was at a time that many of the old ranchers, their hired hands, were still there. Families, the original families, Brazel, Proctor, Saltemeyer, Strickland, all were still there. And we just haven't attempted to do anything of that nature since. So, Rob, you make a good suggestion that we need to go back. We need to go back.
The greatest, yeah, their peers that were getting of age by then were the greatest generation that knew how imperative it was to pay attention to stranger danger. I live in a small community. We know everybody that lives here. We can spot an outsider instantly.
Right.
So that needs to be remedied with them. For those, the old timers have died off. There's younger generations, and I dare say that there's still a lot of trauma there, but you'd probably have a lot greater success now to announce yourselves coming into it even ahead of time with the intent that we don't have to even discuss the relevance if it's true or not. We're more concerned, and it would be a legitimate concern that we want to heal this fear that's been instilled this generation, because you've realized by trying to set up this previous interview, decades ago, that you've come to realize that there was a lot of trauma there that would be the only explanation of why they didn't show up. And I'm sure that those people would still attest to why they didn't show up by now. Somebody will tell you the truth of it. And community leaders will be the ones, like tribal leaders, to come forward. If they believe your intent is altruistic,
Genuine.
they'll step forward and convince the community to come out and talk for once.
And the fact that 26 years have transpired, or 24 years have transpired, that I'd like to believe that we've earned their trust. We've demonstrated our agenda, our objectives, to the point that there should be little doubt whose side we're on. And I think this is an exercise that I need to pursue. I love the fact that that's one of the reasons I love doing shows such as this, because there's an equal exchange of information, ideas. And this is another shiny example where I walk away and it's like, I have new work to do. I have a new project that someone provided me with a new way of looking at a past situation. And we need to follow up. We need some closure. We need to, again, do more than just investigate. We also need to provide counsel. We need to provide protection.
Yes.
We've done this with individuals where we've said, now, anybody harasses, anyone intimidates, anyone threatens you in any way, you call us immediately. We've even had lawyers who have worked with us for years that have been on standby. I even had someone at the Marine Corps, or a colonel at the Pentagon. He was head of Marine intelligence. Calls me up one afternoon, tells me who he is, and he says, I want you to call this number. I call the number, and it's the Pentagon switchboard. I'd like to speak to Colonel so-and-so, and there he was. And he warns me at the time, he says, Don, the closer you get to the truth, the more difficult they're going to make it for you. But that will include your witnesses as well. He said, I want you to keep my number close by. He says, because if that ever happens, if you or any of your people feel threatened in any way, he said, you call me and I will call out the Marines. That's how he put it. Now, I kept that number, and we would talk occasionally thereafter, but I never had to call out the Marines as far as him leading the charge. But we've never done it with an entire community. We've never done it as far as with ground zero, as this happened back in 47. The people who would have all been involved, because they would have all been hearing stories. That material was out there on that debris field for days before it was reported. So they were all gathering up souvenirs. They were all going to check out where this flying saucer had crashed. And then to hear the stories afterwards, the way their houses were ransacked and their sheds floorboards were torn up and water towers were tipped and sacks of feed were slid open and dumped to the ground. And what they did to Mac Brazo, the very rancher, how they abducted him for 5 full days and deprived him of food and water and sleep and subjected him to a full body cavity search, while he was being detained at the base during that time. So you're absolutely correct, both of you, that I need to go back and really demonstrate that we weren't there just to retrieve information, that we are still there to stand with them and their families. And if they ever need us for any reason, that we will call out the Marines.
it's
Right.
not for self-serving purposes that you're there.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
that you're actually going to add value back to them. If any place were ever generationally devastated from a UFO event, it would be Roswell. I mean, imagine the locals, how they feel every year when people roll into Roswell and they're partying and they're having a good time, but in silence, all the locals that lived there during the time, or had relatives, they're in silent resentment. And it's like if these people really knew the true story, they wouldn't be so happy about it, because what happened to our families wasn't right, and that wound needs reconciled.
And the late Frankie Rowe, her father was Dan Dwyer, who was a crew chief with the Roswell Fire Department. And because of what her father had seen out at the impact site north of town, and then what she had seen, one of the state police officers by the name of Robert Scroggins had brought to show to his friends at the firehouse as he was returning to his home in Hobbs, which is east of Roswell. So she handled a piece of the memory material. And that evening, there's an officer by the name of First Lieutenant Arthur Philbin, with 3 non-commissioned officers at the back door by the kitchen, and listening to her mother try to cover for her and her sister as they're hiding in the bedroom. And eventually hearing the footsteps coming down the hallway, and then the door burst open, and there's the officer with a baton, a stick. And as he is slamming into his hand, warning them that if they ever say a word about what Frankie saw, if she ever says a word, we will take you out into the desert and you will never see your family again. Frankie couldn't talk about that for years without breaking down. And it took her years to come and be part of our commemoration at the annual festival, the first weekend of July.
Yeah.
At the Roswell Museum. And then she embraced it, because one by one, these tourists, these visitors who were there, they weren't there to get her autograph. They weren't there to get a picture taken with her. They were there to comfort her. They were there to tell her that they were ashamed that that would happen here in our country of all places, that the children would be threatened over a damn weather balloon, and that there are now adults that are still trying to convince us that that's all it was, but that you and your family and other families were threatened with death for something so mundane, so off the shelf. And so, as I said, it was a illumination on her part. And I made sure I always sat with her, that I was with her, and that if anyone ever gave her a hard time, you tell them to come over and talk to me. You talk to me. But Rob, Tim, I can't agree more. We need to do this in Corona. We really do.
Yes.
We need to perform a form of exorcism, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yes.
And thank you. I can't thank you enough. Really, really.
Yes. Any last thoughts, Rob?
I got some friends in high places, and I'd really like to help you with that project any way I can. And I have some very influential friends that could make sure we have the resources needed to get it done, and the protection the community would need. Yeah, I could help with that.
I will take you up on that. I truly will.
I am actually involved with one of those friends in high places as well, so
yeah.
I can also help out maybe.
Clearly, because I think this program this evening accomplished much more than I think any one of us expected. I think we created an opportunity that it's not that we intentionally overlooked it, it's that we never considered it.
Right.
Yeah.
And as a result, different perspectives, and from their standpoint, and the idea that there's still trauma, there's still emotional healing that
Mhm.
needs to take place. And if
It's
we
like-
can be the instillers, or at least help to steer them in that direction, who
Yes.
Right.
better to do it? Who better to
A
do it?
safe place to
Oh,
a
I was
safe
gonna
place to
say
heal.
I was going to say real quick, it's like they have PTSD.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
So,
We have, we
um,
have we have talked about that, Tim. We do, but this would be the first time that we actually would, the idea that we would, aside from call me, no, we're going to go to them.
yes,
We're
there
gonna
you go.
we're gonna take, as far as the rescue squad to them. Yes,
There
yes.
you
Exactly.
go. Good
Triage.
idea. Yes.
Mhm. I love it. I love it. Great, great.
Let's go around and take last comments and wrap this up. I think it was a wonderful talk tonight, Don. Thank you very much for coming back again. I really appreciate it. More than welcome to come back a third time too, so we can talk
Well,
more.
and I think we demonstrate, Tim, that we always have new approaches, new perspectives, and we didn't even get into any of the new information or new things that. So right there, we clearly
Part
have
three.
part three. Part three.
All right, we will do that. So, Rob, any last comments?
Oh, I'm looking forward to see. I'm always trying to help people with my endeavors of giving back to others. As I've been given to. So if I can be part of, and I'm happy to hear that you're willing to invest back in that community, because I recognize the trauma from that. And maybe your next book needs to be the healing of Roswell, something to that effect, because they need it.
Yes.
And Tom will be pleased to hear that it all started with a zero attendance lecture at the Corona High School, and we
Mhm.
weren't intuitive enough to realize what was at stake for the community. We were
It
looking
was a
at it
cry for help.
from our perspective, and we weren't considering what they may have been wrestling with, what they were living with, and the obstacles and the potential threats and intimidation that kept them away.
Hmm.
This is
And
tremendous.
it's also starting on the UFO Man channel.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes.
So
Yes.
that's a real cool thing. And Rob is a great asset to the channel, and that's why I bring him on, because he's a wealth of knowledge.
Oh,
And
I
so-
love it. I mean, absolutely, Rob. You've done your homework. You have brought up topics that not only impressed me, but that most people within the UFO community have only danced around. The
Right,
fact that you
exactly.
actually have looked into them and you have applied your own background, your own military expertise as to there's two sides to everything.
Mhm.
And what's wonderful about Roswell is the fact that having both military and civilians involved, there are your two sides. But
Right.
Okay.
as we've established tonight, there's also a third side, and that's the investigation. And that the fact that the investigation has to apply a two-prong approach, and that there's the military consideration as to uh, the level of security and orders that are applied that prevent them from disclosure. And then on the part of the civilians, where it may be nothing more than fear and
Yeah.
threats that are silencing them. So it's all encompassing. And that's, again, you've just created another whole avenue that we need to approach regarding this investigation. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart, both of you. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. I would like to show everybody the books that are available by Don Schmitt on Amazon. There are quite a few. Some are repeated. So, Don, you can explain them as I go. Here's one.
Witness to Roswell is the most recent. It's the 75th anniversary edition of our best-selling book, Witness to Roswell, which was the number one selling UFO book in the world for 3 straight years. It's the one I had mentioned earlier with the foreword by the late Dr. Edgar Mitchell. the afterword by George Norrie of the Coast to Coast nighttime TV or radio show. So this is the second edition of the Inside Wright-Patterson. That is everything transited through Roswell. Its the final destination was Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, which is where they did all the testing and analysis. So it's all the witnesses on the receiving end. We talked to as many of the witnesses in the Roswell situation, and then those who were involved in the testing and the guarding of the hangars, the facilities, the underground vaults, and other areas at Wright Pat. So it's the second part to what happened in July of 1947. The Truth About is the paperback edition of our hardback, the second book that Kevin Rando and I did, and it was another bestseller. So this is a copy of the very first book, UFO Crash at Roswell, which was made into our first best-selling book and was made in the Golden Globe-nominated movie Roswell, starring Kyle MacLachlan, Martin Sheen, and Dwight Yoakam. And it was nominated Best Made-for-TV Movie by the Golden Globes in 1995.
Own it, have it. Great movie.
And this is Witness to Roswell. So this is Unmasking the 60-Year Cover-Up. So from the eyewitness standpoint, this is the hardcover of the children of Roswell. As much as the parents had their stories, we realized very early on that the families also had their involvement, had their witnessing of the intimidation, the threats that their families, their parents lived through. And so we started interviewing the children. And it's a very heartwarming and a rather frightening book in a sense that it gets very intense with what happened and how the children of Roswell were subjected to some very brutal tactics on the part of the government. And this is the hardcover edition of Witness to Roswell. This is the library edition. This is the re-edition, the printing of the Project Blue book by the late Brad Steiger. And it was his late wife, Sherry, that asked me to write the foreword. And I was quite honored. Brad was a dear friend, and I can pay much of my involvement in the very subject back to some of his earlier writings. And so Brad is sorely missed. And again, I was very honored to write the foreword to that book. This is the first book on Wright Pat, Inside the Real Area 51. Now, mind you, 51 did not even originate until 1955, so 8 years after Roswell. So the real Area 51 back in 1947 was the Foreign Technology Labs at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. And there's the hardcover. This is actually, I believe this is from the French cover of the Children of Roswell. So, and this is our second most recent book, Roswell: The Ultimate Cold Case Closed. This was our day in court where we wrote the book as though we were in a courtroom. We presented our opening arguments and then our evidentiary, our best witnesses, our best testimony from all of our best witnesses, and then our closing arguments. And as far as we are concerned, we have done our due diligence and demonstrated what Roswell actually involved, the crash of a craft of unknown origin, and as far as we're concerned, case closed. And this was a book that I authored by myself, as how the government at the time shut down the media, shut down the military, shut down the civilians involved, how they shut down the politicians, and all the way up to the contemporary, all the way up to the present, and how the government is still doing all they can to shut down the Roswell incident.
All these
Mhm.
books are available online at Amazon. So if you want to pick up a copy, feel free to do so. I'm sure Don Schmitt will be very appreciative. We will as well. It will continue the narrative, and you can get caught up on all the research and documentation. And I'm sure maybe in the future there will be a book called The Healing of Roswell, suggested by our own Rob Heatherly. So
Yes.
we'll see. And if there is, that'd be cool.
We'll come up with
And I want to get a signed copy if that's the case.
guaranteed.
Anyways, I want to thank everybody who watched online. I want to thank Don Schmitt for being here again. Like I said, you're more than welcome to come back for part 3, which we'll be looking forward to, definitely. I will get a hold of Tom Reed in regards to what we discussed before the live stream. So I'll take care of that. Rob, thank you very much for co-hosting tonight. You did a wonderful job. I'm sorry I disappeared for a while. I had technical difficulties. The storm we had knocked me offline, so I had to come back that way. But anyways, thanks to everybody online. Thanks to everybody in the chat. Please remember to come next Saturday evening. We're going to have a woman on by the name of Elena Danan. She's an author, an archaeologist, a druidess, a psychic, a contactee, an experiencer, and she claims to be an emissary of the Galactic Federation. So please come by and check out her interview next Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern. And from all of us on the panel, we want to say good evening and good night.
Good night from Don Schmitt. Thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. Good night, Rob.
Good night.